Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Night Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Hello everyone, welcome to the podcast today. We are talking about the repurposing of transmission connections. I'm Kyle Murchie and I'm joined with me Philip Bale and Catherine Cleary.
Hi Kyle.
Hi there. So there's a lot of change happening obviously in the industry, as we know, and our other podcasts cover. So with that in mind, what we wanted to do is just give a bit of an update on where things are and some considerations if you have projects now and are looking to maybe make some changes either now or once the new TMO4 Plus process comes into play. As we said, that will change, but this gives you a bit of a good kind of starting point. So who wants to kick off?
I think I'll kick off if you want. I think probably just for setting the scene. So if we go back 10 years, maybe even less, traditionally transmission connections, we're talking about very big generators. We're thinking about really big industrial commercial customers, often what we classify as dirty demand in terms of big manufacturing sites, sort of steelworks, aluminium smelters, those sorts of things. And now we've got a variety of different connections. We've got people that have got generation projects for renewables, for the solar, the batteries. We've got far more people for hydrogen looking at connections that have got connections. We're seeing far more in the data center space and other connections looking at transmission. And one of the things that people are often starting to ask us is around repurposing those connections, either people that have got existing transmission connections or people that have got connection offers for schemes. And obviously, I think this is a chance, isn't it, for all of us to go through as to there aren't an awful lot of rules at the moment. There's unwritten rules. I think we're going to get rules that are coming out very shortly on what will be allowable and what isn't. And then at which point we can go through and talk about what we think they're going to be and what's good practice and what's not, specifically focusing on final demand and non-final demand and generation sites.
Yeah, so I suppose I completely agree, Philip, that, I mean, even not going back as far as 10 years, but just, really up until the very recent sort of, last 6 months, 12 months, there's been a huge amount of flexibility. And effectively, it's always been a kind of bilateral conversation with the ESO to say, I've got this contracted scheme, I'm thinking of making this change, what's the best way to do that? Traditionally, it's been a MODAP, but whereas in the distribution space, there has been this concept of allowable changes and material changes, the idea being an allowable change, something you can submit a new application, but you don't go to the back of the queue, you just get a reoffer based on that sort of slight change, versus a material change, where again, it's the same process, you're still physically submitting the same form, but very importantly, you are taken out of the existing queue, everyone beneath you is considered, and you are kind of added back into the bottom of it when the DNO restudies that connection. And that concept, I think, was really lacking at transmission. So what used to happen, you'd submit a MODAP, and, you would, if you were going from, a wind farm to a wind farm plus solar or something like that, you would be sort of, taken out of the queue, as it were, and then put back in your existing position and restudied. So if you weren't changing your tech, you could be fairly kind of confident that things like your connection date, your enabling works weren't going to change. And I suppose, there are two things that have happened. I think one is the industry awareness of this fact has increased and people have said, that's not really fair. And also, people have been trying to do it an awful lot more. So I think the number of MODAPs that we've seen, which have included technology change, technology additions, and I think now in the last recent months, people are trying to do some pretty weird and wacky things. I've got a battery, but could it maybe be a data center? They're starting to be less plausible conversations, aren't they? And I think so we're really supportive of the need for formalization of a policy at transmission level that talks about what is an allowable change. But they're going to use slightly different terminology. Is that right, Kyle?
Yeah, so they're looking at using what you're basically defining what's significant and what's minor in terms of level of change. And because of the new process, so originally, if you've looked at the annex that came out as part of the CMP 434 consultation.
Who hasn't?
Yes.
I have not looked at all of the annexes.
Great read.
Yeah, that great read, yeah. Well, actually, the majority of the table needs to be redrafted now anyway, because it talked about, making a change between your initial gate 1 position to gate 2, then if you were between gate 1 and gate 2, and then once you were, had achieved gate 2 and making further changes. Now, with the whole Gate 1 concept now no longer mandatory, that will have to be altered. Just to note that while that term significant is being used, it has been challenged. It might not be the legal wording that ends up being used as part of the legal text, but that's what you'll see at the moment. To help, the ESO did provide some initial kind of draft of guidance and some examples. But the examples, I would say, were a pretty simplistic starting point, really important starting point, but they were pretty simple, looking at offers that were single stage, single technology, moving to another technology, or a coal plant, for example, looking to make a change to a solar farm. And really, they're just highlighting, well, in those cases, it'd be significant because
they need to restudy it.
Yes, because it's a completely different technology type. It's going to be dispatched in a different way. What we didn't really get into is what if you were, had a 2-stage project and you were looking at solar and a battery, and you're now looking to change the battery into a longer duration variant, for example, or as you mentioned, around using that demand for something else, whether it was hydrogen or data center, etc. And that's the sort of detail that probably most projects are looking at. But at this moment in time, it's the kind of founding principles that are there, and once they get updated again with the new reformed process, as that gets defined, then the next step will be that important guidance. But I suppose the important bit there is it is still going to be guidance. So even in the initial draft, it might give example scenarios, but it will come down to some level of bilateral conversation because they can't cover everything.
No, which I think makes sense. And that's what we tend to see in the distribution world, is that broadly there is agreement on what's allowable and what's not. I wouldn't say it's 100% followed all of the time. There's every so often some rogue agreements that come out that look like they're a little bit sort of different to the guidance. But I think it does make sense. So at least there's a really clear starting ground.
Yeah.
And also, hopefully, for existing transmission customers, they can then make much more informed decisions as to how they want to leave their assets, what's the boundary, what things they could consider and couldn't consider, and then make well-informed decisions that's in the interest of GB PLC.
I guess, is it worth us talking about the fact, perhaps like the reason we're doing this podcast? Because we're sort of telling you that we don't know yet what the future exact policy will say, but there are a number of potential changes that people, I would say, on repeat have kind of come to us to ask about, and there is beginning to be a bit of agreement about those. So I guess I was going to throw one example out there, which is battery connections. So customers who've had offers accepted that were studied, perhaps a couple of years ago, and they've got a storage connection. So they have import and export, and they are looking to change the import capacity element of that. They're saying, right, if I had perhaps battery and solar, could this now be solar and some form of final demand? And the kind of rationale that often the customer is thinking is, well, you told me that you studied my battery as, potentially continuously importing or continuously exporting. So presumably that means whatever I change it to, as long as I don't change my tech and my demand capacity, I should be good, right? A restudy shouldn't change it. And I think that we've kind of had to go back to challenge that assumption to say, actually, there are two things that definitely potentially do risk your connection date and enabling works there. And one is the fact that we have changed, that the ESO and TOs have changed the way they study batteries. Mm-hmm. So everyone, even if your connection was originally studied as being a kind of, 100% capacity factor type simplistic battery arrangement, it has since been restudied, and all of the good work that's being done on the Transmission Works Review, takes into account those wins. So that capacity has effectively already been reallocated, and you can't now change your technology type and dispatch at a different time and expect there to be no impact. That's definitely my view. And the other point is moving from battery demand to final demand.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's also around the levels of security supply that people want and expecting there to be multiple bays. But we have had people coming and saying, well, if I have 2 battery projects at the same project, can I reutilize both of those bays and add them together? And yeah, I mean, it's regulatory as much as anything in terms of going through and doing it. And there again, common sense on the distribution world was designed to stop people doing what people are arguably trying to do, which is coming in, having an option, fairly grey option, developing it to a certain degree, reserving their position, then transitioning to something completely different whilst retaining their queue position. I think that's ultimately where we are with transmission now, of rightly so, people saying, if you can't develop what you applied for, you can reapply, but it is at the back of the queue. You relinquish your position, the assets that you were reserving, and it does make sense.
And I think it also helps counteract the trend that we see for people associating a queue position with a kind of effectively a monetary value of the project. So saying, well, I bagged my place in the queue, and therefore this has value, even if it's for a battery project, and I don't think that, perhaps the market is not going to sort of support that level of battery projects in the future. But that's fine. I'll just sell my grid offer basically, and I'll make back some money off that. And that kind of assumption perpetuates the behavior where people want to get in the grid queue because they think, this has a value. And I suppose we want the message to be really clear from the ESO to come back and say, no, actually, your queue position has a value for the specific project, the specific technology that you applied for. It doesn't have a value. You can't just flip it to someone to build something else out. Otherwise, we might as well basically start just auctioning off grid capacity.
Yeah, and I think there is a slight difference though between people who have applied and got a contractual position versus also people who have got physical assets that are currently there. And I think that's one of the things that also is going to need some guidance in terms of what can be done, what can't be done. And also the slight differences that we see at the different TOs across the border is obviously if you apply for a final demand connection in England and Wales at the moment, you will get a 132, 33, 66 connection point. You won't have a 400 kV bay. Whereas if you do it north of the border up in Scotland, we are seeing for some of the final demand sites where you are getting 400 kV bays. And I think there again, I suspect we probably won't get some consistency there because they are different TOs. But I think that's one of the things that will be interesting to see, especially for England and Wales, and especially people that have 400 kV bay connections at the moment. Another reason why they don't end up with final demand sites as well.
I think one of the differences there around the kind of Scottish arrangement that's been offered is that, yeah, you get 400 kV bay, but that 400 kV bay is built out of your sites. You're not owning any other transmission assets in terms of circuits, etc. So I think there's a slight variation there, but it's a really good point that we've obviously arrived at that scenario via kind of individual TOs doing those assessments. We are aware that certainly TOs are looking at demand strategies, and that will obviously flow into this discussion as well around what would be allowable change. Because as I've said earlier, if you've got a power station or like a power station contract, so directly connected power station contracts, then to try to move that to final demand, you're now actually changing your BCA type rather than simply altering the tech or the capacity within that agreement.
I think that's a really important point. I don't know to what degree the wider industry is really aware of that, because perhaps people who have been really familiar with the generation world have probably never really seen those kind of types of agreements. But yeah, a BCA, your connection agreement with National Grid, most parties will be familiar with the front page, which says this is a directly connected power station, effectively what every kind of generator connected has. And actually, a demand customer like a data center would be classed as what's called a non-embedded customer. So that kind of the format of the legal agreement itself is different. And I have had some discussions where recently the ESO has come out to individual customers and said quite clearly, if you want to change, your battery to, a data center, firstly, we're going to need to restudy it. Obviously, we're going to need to look at the assets that are required. It might need 2 bays, for example, in the substation. So it might really fundamentally change your connection date and your works. But more importantly, you are going to need to reapply to us. This cannot be done through a mod app. And I think I kind of support that because that's quite consistent with what we've always said in the past, that if you are changing agreement types, it's a new application. Kind of makes sense. I think, from their perspective, from a process point. But it's really important, in today's context, where, as of kind of yesterday's announcement, new applications will be given, only kind of these indicative stage 1 offers, whereas a mod app, can carry on getting a full offer. It's really important, is it a mod app or is it a new application? Even if both of them go to sort of, the back of the queue, as it were, there's still a difference for customers.
And another thing that I've had is I had a conversation with someone that was looking at a site that had a non-embedded final demand site with the view of, well, let's just make this connection 4 times bigger. And then turning around saying, well, actually, I'm not sure you'd end up with the same technical solution. And you have to consider everything else in terms of wider, bigger picture of, actually, if you've got a site and it's going to become significantly different, the connection may look completely different. So I think there is an element of anyone that's going through and looking at a connection, whether it already be final demand or an existing sort of thermal power station or a contracted position for a battery, to really consider what they're trying to do and what the most likely outcome is going to be, even before we end up getting the formal guidance.
Yeah, and you mean and you mean outcome in terms of the physical electrical design solution? You know, how many bays, how many circuits back to it? Yeah,
and where you're connecting to. Yeah. It may not be the same geographical location that you previously had a connection at if that site is already full and it's not appropriate to amend it.
I mean, I think basically it's probably pretty true to say that it turns out in a grid that is this oversubscribed, accommodating final demand connections in an SQSS compliant way is really quite challenging.
Yeah, I think it often depends on, and there again, it all depends on the assumptions that are being made around battery storage and whether, again, are they a help, are they a hindrance, and what are they doing? And we may find a scenario that if we do end up with as much intermittent generation and as much storage that we expect to be there, and when are they charging, when are they discharging, the pinch points may end up being very different. I mean, if you think about a off gas electricity network, sometimes the peak demand can be at 3 o'clock in the morning when electric heating, storage heating kicks in, and that's the design that you go through. We may find a transmission network with very different demand flows, and some of the final demand sites we're looking at, like data centers, might have an influence on that.
I think just on that design factor, if there's people out there thinking, well, I know what a 500 megawatt battery would look like, single circuit connecting to a 400 kV bay, that same scale as a final demand, you could be looking at 3 circuits or even 4 circuits. And as we said, a connection in at 132 kV with a new 132 kV substation built, which also has an impact as well on what your current bay ownership status is as well. So I think it was something that was really interesting as well in the concept of the 2 different types of BCA, is that as we've also discussed it internally, we'll continue to do so, but what if you're in a situation where you are a final demand customer now, you've progressed with a project like that, but you are building out for hydrogen or data center, etc., but you will need to have some sort of generation or storage on site in the future, either now or in the future.
Yeah.
How would you manage that? Is it realistic to have 2 BCAs for one connection point as a banked connection? You could see that would be a possible route, but not necessarily the most efficient. But if you did combine it under the current approach and the current rules and the way that those are set out, they're not designed to cater for, one is not designed to cater for tech and the other is not really designed to cater for final demand.
And also considering what application you're making to what outcome you'll have. So there again, if you are applying for a final demand site and you want to have generation, do you do it now knowing it might hinder your application because of a delay around the generation side of things? Do you do it in the future, not knowing whether it's going to be allowable change? It's quite a grey area, but hopefully we will have some guidance, and that guidance will consider that as well. Obviously, the guidance can't go into every scenario, but hopefully some common sense will apply. That means that you then can't do the things which makes logical sense.
I think, on the one hand, there does need to be common sense, but I think there is a danger in saying, trying to sort of be the judge and jury and say, well, this scheme feels like it's majority demand, so we're going to give it a demand connection agreement. And I think, the issue there is, well, hang on a moment, if you've got a customer that's applied for some tech, you can't give them a connection agreement that doesn't include tech, that tech capacity. So there are some really fundamental kind of legal implications from the CUSC that I think do need to be considered. And we are seeing a bit of an issue there that perhaps the ESO is kind of taking a view to say, well, these customers feel like they're in this group. And I think it does need to be really clearly tied back to what people applied for. Otherwise, we've just kind of, ridden roughshod over CUSC.
Yeah, it needs to be sorted out now from a buildability point of view in terms of being able to get the investment required and making sure that the legal text is all robust enough. But then even thinking ahead towards then end compliance would be extremely difficult if you actually have tech and a generator on site, but you're a final demand and you're following the final demand guidance. That would be
very problematic.
At the moment they don't align.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and in terms of sort of strategy, it probably is in everyone's interests, i.e. both the connecting applicant and the ESO and TO's interests, for sort of all elements of the project to be defined as early as possible at the application stage. Because you mentioned, Kyle, I was quite interested, that the kind of guidance the ESO has come out with so far in terms of what would be significant changes or sort of, permitted changes, they are quite simple examples and they don't include things like staged connections, whereas from the work we've done, a lot of the customers we work with, they do have staged connections because they've gone in for perhaps battery, which they can deliver first, and then there's some solar that comes on, there might be some wind that's kind of further down the line. And so you've got kind of stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 of this connection. Some of them might be non-firm, and I think now we're seeing the challenges associated with the fact that maybe when that offer was issued, there wasn't a huge degree of scrutiny to say, okay, well, here's your tech at each of these 3 phases, and here are your restrictions on availability. But they didn't actually ask, what are you building? So seeing like, is your tech, so your sort of installed capacity effectively, is that well defined per stage? Have you defined, if it's wind and solar and storage, have you defined how much of that is each one of the, really kind of basic things that I guess we sort of think, well, there should be a single line diagram that goes with that. But then looking back and seeing that actually people got staged offers without having to provide staged single line diagrams. So the more detail that you can kind of pin in as the baseline, the easier it will be, I think, for everyone to administer these kind of rules regarding what the kind of future changes are.
I mean, I think agreed that in terms of the transmission, unprecedented levels of connection applications, which means the connection offers that have come out from being tens a year to multiple hundreds per year in terms of coming through. And obviously that's had an unintended consequences of the same information isn't necessarily in there. And I agree with you that now a lot of these applications look far more complex than you would see on a traditional transmission scheme that's going through. So then, yeah, there probably does need to be a retrospectively of, let's clarify exactly what you've got at each different stage to go through to make it abundantly clear and re-benchmark.
I think it's that clarification. So in my mind, I do see a difference between someone who is saying, this project isn't going to work for me anymore. I want to kind of, try and turn it into something else that I can sell to someone, kind of a bit of a complete U-turn on technologies or so, versus someone who's saying, look, this is actually what I intended when I applied. We just didn't do a particularly good job of documenting that. So we want to clarify what is in each stage. And I do really want us to set up an environment that encourages people to do that, rather than sort of say, oh no, well, hang on a moment, if your clarification might lead to your project being sent to the back of the queue. So I guess that's like quite a narrow, delicate line to walk, isn't it?
We probably need actually going forward is maybe to split out that term stage, because really, as we've just been talking there, the stage could mean one technology connecting to one bay, but stage in terms of tech actually coming online, all the way through to a different technology per stage, potentially a different technology per stage connecting to a different bay. Therefore you've got TO implications as well. Where do your works actually finish? Your works could all finish on stage 1, or they might finish on stage 3 or 4, which that level of complexity just means that term stage just probably captures far too many things, making it really difficult, even going forward in the new future, where you've got milestones based on each stage.
Yeah, what is the stage? Based
on the gate to date or a gate to acceptance date for each stage. Actually, that could become quite muddy for certain project types, the more complex ones.
And obviously all of this comes at a time when the ESO and TO are busier than ever, and they're starting to deliver projects at transmission level. So it is still going to be very challenging for them to go through and do these level of clarifications. I mean, obviously they're needed, because it makes sense for everyone to know what they can do, what they can't do, what are the black and whites, where are the grey areas. One is clarifications, but also doing that at a time for lots of projects when some of them are going through into construction and more of them will be going through into construction. It's a challenging time still.
Yeah, definitely. I guess, there's really good precedent that's been set in the DNO world, isn't there, in terms of, so I think we know what the format of good allowable changes guidance looks like. So I suppose that helps. But yeah, definitely a bit of work still required.
We've also definitely seen some of the challenges in the DNO world where that clarity hasn't been there in terms of, with tech and KEC are obviously transmission terms, but levels of install capacity versus export, whether it's in megawatts or MVA and things like that. We've definitely seen the complications on projects that have gone from being high-level designs to varied many times with the formal documents not going through. So I think it's us taking a lot of the knowledge that we see from schemes that are going through development and build in the DNO world, and then saying, this is what the best practice for transmission should look like in order to try and avoid some of those very awkward conversations at a later stage.
Well, I think that brings us to a nice close. So thank you very much for joining me today. And do stay tuned, because there will be further updates in the next few, well, hopefully the next few months. If you don't hear from us before then, things have been delayed. But we look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Kyle.
Cheers.
Thank you for taking your precious time to listen to this episode. Now, not everyone is ready to have a connectologist in their life. For others, it's just too expensive. And as our team is so small, we do have to be very selective in what work we take on. And that's why we put so much effort into these shows. We want our society to have the equitable energy system it needs in order to decarbonise and to thrive. So we want to help to topple as many connections barriers as we possibly can, in spite of our size. So please do feel free to ping a link to this episode to anyone you know who might be interested, because it would mean so much to everyone here.